Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Your comments connect us across the silence, across the distance, across the hours when the world feels most still. And if this quiet story brings you peace, consider subscribing and liking it helps us continue sharing these slow tales from forgotten corners of the past. Now, close your eyes if you wish, or simply breathe slower, because this is a story that begins where most end with a man who chose silence and a cabin that kept his name. High in the mountains, past where even the wind hesitates, there is a small wooden cabin tucked beneath the trees, so quiet that even the birds avoid singing too close to its roof. And in that cabin lives a hunter whose voice hasn't been heard by another soul in longer than anyone would remember. He built the place himself, board by board, years ago, after a fire in the valley and a grief too deep to carry among men. And ever since then, the only footsteps around it have been his own. No letters arrive, no horses tie up at the post, no. Laughter echoes through the timbers, just wind, the creak of aging wood, and the faint thud of a man walking with purpose only he understands. His days are simple and silent. Water from the stream before dawn, firewood chopped by noon, dried meat hung carefully above the hearth, traps checked under moonlight. He speaks to no one, not even himself, and if words ever rise in his throat, they stay there, like smoke that never leaves the chimney. Some winters bring deep snow that swallows the doorframe, and in those months the hunter becomes more ghost than man, moving through his home like breath, appearing by the fire, vanishing into the pines. He has no mirror, no photographs, no keepsakes, only a long rifle, a worn coat, and eyes that look like they remember too much but say nothing. When he sleeps, he does not dream, or if he does, the dreams do not return with him to the waking world. The walls of the cabin are thick, but not thick enough to keep out memory, and sometimes when the wind moves just right, it sounds like a voice he once knew, calling from the lake. But he never answers. To answer would mean to admit that someone once called him by name, and that is something he no longer allows himself to remember. The lake below the cabin freezes late and thaws early, like it refuses to be predictable. And he respects that. He never fishes it, only watches sometimes for hours, his breath steady, his eyes unreadable. This is not a man waiting for company, nor is he hiding from it. He has simply grown into silence the way trees grow into stone. Slowly, patiently, without regret. The locals in the valley still speak of him sometimes, in hushed tones at the tavern, calling him the one who vanished upward or the ghost with a gun. But no one comes looking, and he never comes down. And so the seasons turn, and the cabin holds its breath, a place where even time walks gently, and the man inside forgets the sound of his own name, unaware that far beyond the ridge, something is beginning. The snow had fallen in silence, blanketing the mountain in a soft white stillness that erased every memory of movement, and the hunter, as always, rose before the sun to walk the ridgeline above the lake, his boots leaving careful, familiar prints behind him until he came to the edge of the clearing and saw them, tracks, dozens of them, pressed deep into the snow, a single line of footsteps moving in formation, too many to count quickly, and none of them his. He stood still, heart slow but senses sharp, staring at the trail that hadn't been there yesterday, the kind of trail made not by wanderers, but by people who knew exactly where they were going. They came from the east, winding up from the forest in a line that curved around the edge of the frozen lake and disappeared toward the northern hills. And though no voices carried, no smoke rose, and no shadows moved, he felt them, whoever they were, as if they had left not just footprints, but a presence behind. The snow should have muffled it, should have erased their warmth, but somehow it didn't. Something about the way the prints were spaced, steady and precise, told him this was not an accident, not a passing of strangers, but an arrival. They had come here for a reason, and that reason, though still unknown, suddenly filled the air like breath held too long. He followed the tracks slowly, not out of curiosity, but obligation, each step deliberate, each breath a cloud in the cold. Morning light, and as he moved through the trees, he noticed how the birds had gone quiet, how even the wind held back its usual complaint, as if the whole forest was watching with him, waiting. He reached the bend where the trees opened, just enough to see the far shore of the lake. And there he stopped, not because he saw anyone, but because the track stopped too, abruptly, in a wide arc that circled the base of an old pine tree and ended in silence. There were no signs of fire, no abandoned gear, no blood or broken branches, only the snow, clean and white, holding the shape of boots that had stood still, and then, somehow, vanished. The hunter crouched, gloved fingers tracing one of the deeper impressions, feeling its depth, its weight, trying to listen to what it said. But snow does not speak in words, it remembers weight, direction, intent, and nothing else. He rose slowly and looked around, senses open now to every sound, every shift in light, every break in rhythm. There was nothing, and yet everything had changed. Someone had come to this mountain, not to visit or pass through, but to arrive, and they had done so without a word, without leaving their name, without showing their faces. The hunter turned back toward the cabin, the trees whispering behind him in a language only silence could understand. And though his face gave nothing away, his steps were no longer those of a man alone. He walked now with the awareness that his mountain, his lake, his quiet world had been entered, and that whatever had left those tracks had not truly left at all. The lake had always been a mirror, sometimes for the sky, sometimes for memory, but on that gray morning it became a boundary, a line between the known and the unknowable. And when the hunter stepped outside with his breath still fogging in the cold, his eyes caught something that made the air feel thicker. Across the frozen surface, far beyond the thin ice and the snow-covered reeds, a row of dark shapes stood motionless among the trees, not close enough to be seen clearly, but near enough to change the silence. They did not move, not even as the wind tugged at the limbs above them, and in that stillness, there was no aggression, only certainty, like sentinels who had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He did not raise his rifle, did not step forward, did not speak. He simply stood, watching them as they watched him, and the lake between them held its breath, as if refusing to carry sound or ripple. They were tall, some wrapped in cloaks or fur, some barely more than outlines carved into morning fog, and though none approached, none turned away either. It was not an ambush, not quite, but it felt like a siege without weapons, a presence so unshakable that even the trees seemed to lean back. The hunter counted them slowly, not exactly one by one, but by instinct, more than he expected, more than should be possible without notice. And yet, they had arrived all at once or over time, he didn't know. But there they were, dozens, perhaps 100, silent and unmoving, like statues carved from memory and cold. The hunter's breath shallowed, not from fear, but from recognition, because something in their posture, in the way they did not announce themselves, reminded him of old ceremonies, old debts, and the kind of gathering that happens only when silence has carried too many stories too far. Still, he said nothing. He only turned slowly, went back inside, closed the door without locking it, and sat near the window where the glass was too fogged to see clearly, but he knew they were still there. They would not knock, would not call, would not explain, and that made their presence heavier, like smoke with no fire. Night came early that day, and with it a darkness that didn't fully belong to winter, a kind of quiet that pressed against the cabin walls as if trying to enter not with force, but with meaning. And so the hunter sat beside the fire. He did not need, listening to the lake say nothing, and wondering how many stories a man could live before one finally called him back into the open. That night, when the cold pressed harder against the cabin walls than usual, and even the pine logs in the hearth seemed reluctant to burn, the hunter stepped outside, not for need or habit, but for something quieter, a feeling that pulled at him. Like the wind tugs at the edge of a forgotten coat, and as his boots sank softly into the snow, his eyes turned not toward the trees, but toward the lake. And there it was, a fire far off across the ice, flickering against the darkness like a second moon, too distant to feel but too bright to ignore, and most certainly not his. It didn't dance with the frantic hunger of fear or signal distress, nor did it send up smoke like a call for help. It simply existed, steady, unhurried, deliberate, as though someone on the far shore had settled in for the night and lit it not for warmth, but for memory. And that unsettled him more than any sudden sound might have, because he knew every flame he'd ever built on this mountain by the creek, near the cave, under the ridge, and this one belonged to none of them. He watched it for a long time, arms crossed against the cold, heart neither fast nor slow. Because it wasn't danger, he sensed it was presence, undeniable and calm. Whoever had lit that fire had done so knowing it would be seen, not hidden in the woods, not shielded by rock or mist, but out in the open like a flag made of light. And the hunter felt the message without needing the words. We are here. Still. The wind didn't howl that night. Instead, it hummed, as if echoing the fire's slow rhythm, and even the trees seemed to pause, their branches still in the glow of something both sacred and unsaid. Back inside, the hunter didn't light his own fire, not because of fear, but because two fires felt like too many for one night, and he didn't want to compete with whatever ritual was unfolding across the lake. Instead, he sat in the dark, letting the chill settle into the corners of the cabin, letting his eyes adjust to the glow outside that was not his. And in that stillness he remembered nights long before nights when flames had meant family, storytelling, breathing not alone. And he realized that what disturbed him wasn't that someone had lit a fire near his home, but that someone had dared to light a fire near his silence. As hours passed, the fire on the far shore never dimmed, and no shapes moved around it, no voices called, no songs rose, only the steady heartbeat of flame against snow, as if the mountain itself had opened one eye to watch him sleep. And for the first time in many years, the hunter did not sleep deeply, not because of fear, but because something in him had awakened some ember. He thought long cold, and all through the long night, while the lake remained frozen and the stars blinked like quiet witnesses above, he sat beside a fire he had not lit, and wondered what kind of people would burn something so bright without ever needing to be seen. The morning air was colder than usual, the kind that bit through fabric and memory alike, and the hunter, as always, made his quiet way down the narrow path to the lake, carrying his old metal pail, the one with a dent in the side and no handle. Grip left, walking as he had for years, without pause, without sound, without the need to look around until he did, because something on the rocks by the shoreline wasn't snow or stone or driftwood, but something placed, not dropped, a mask, resting carefully on a flat gray boulder, as if it had been waiting for eyes to find it. He stopped before reaching the water, not because of fear, but because of recognition. Though he'd never seen this mask before, still, it felt like something known, as though it carried an echo not of voice, but of memory passed down in silence. It was carved from dark wood, aged and dry, with deep grooves where once paint had been carefully pressed, red lines down the cheeks, white across the brow, black around the eyes. But these were not the markings of war, not in the way stories told them. These were ceremonial, sacred, the kind used when men stood still and asked the mountains for guidance, not when they raised blades. And for a long time, he didn't move closer, because he understood that anything placed so deliberately was not a gift, nor a threat. It was a statement, and one meant to be received on the ground where it was found. Eventually he knelt, the snow crunching softly beneath him, and looked at the mask from below, not daring to touch it. Not yet, because his fingers were not ready to hold something that had watched 100 faces before his. He could see that. The mask had been used, carried, worn, maybe passed from hand to hand through decades of wind and smoke. and he wondered what it had seen when eyes stared through its hollow gaze. This was not a message written in words, not a letter or a warning, but something older, the kind of communication that predates language, that lives in gesture and symbol, in quiet ceremony shared between those who no longer speak to be heard. The hunter sat there beside the mask for a long time, the pail forgotten in the snow, and though no one came to claim it, he knew someone had left it for him, someone who remembered something he had tried so long to forget. He didn't carry the mask back to the cabin, not yet, but he did move it slightly, just a few inches, turning it toward the lake, letting it face the firelight that still flickered across the distant shore. And in that small adjustment, he participated. Without fully understanding, without consent or refusal, he acknowledged what had been placed in front of him. When he finally stood, the cold water waited without question, and as he filled the pail, he noticed how the ripples in the lake moved differently that morning, as if they, too, had seen the mask and now carried a story in their surface. And when he returned to the cabin, the mask stayed behind but in his chest. Something had been carried with him, something painted not in color, but in memory. That night, after the fire across the lake had dimmed to an ember barely visible through the trees, and the wind had settled into a hush that no longer scraped against the windows, the hunter sat alone in his cabin, not thinking, not remembering, just existing as he had for years. But then slowly, something shifted in the stillness, something he couldn't see or hear but only feel, like the tremor before a storm or the weight of breath before speech. It wasn't noise, not quite, but a rhythm, soft, steady, pulsing like a drum being struck gently beneath the floorboards of the earth, or inside his chest. He put down his tin cup, no longer interested in the tea gone cold, and listened not with his ears, but with the space behind his ribs, where memory sometimes echoes. There was no sound, nothing tangible, yet the rhythm remained, a beat just beneath silence, like footsteps muffled in snow, like heartbeats shared between sleeping animals. He stood slowly, letting the feeling settle into his limbs, letting it guide him rather than question it. And with each step across the wooden floor, the rhythm grew more certain, not louder, just more present, as if it was never meant to be heard at all, only felt. It matched his breath, matched the distant pulse in his throat, and when he opened the cabin door and stepped into the dark, he could swear the stars above blinked in time with it. He looked toward the lake, half expecting to see firelight again, half hoping for nothing at all, but the shore remained empty, save for the outline of trees and the faint shimmer of ice beneath the moon. And still the rhythm persisted, inside him now, or beneath him, or perhaps in the space between things, the kind of pulse carried in old songs, sung without sound, in rituals older than language, in the weight of stories passed hand to hand without ever being spoken aloud. He walked slowly toward the tree line, not to find its source, but to follow its presence, his boots pressing into soft snow that seemed, strangely, not to resist. And there, beneath a crooked pine, he stopped not because he saw anything new, but because the beat paused for a single breath, as if acknowledging him. Then it continued, soft as before, unchanging, like a lullaby played for the land itself. He placed his hand against the tree bark, closed his eyes, and let the rhythm move through him, not trying to understand, not needing to name it, because in that moment, he was no longer alone, not truly. Something ancient had reached out across silence, and whether it was memory, spirit, or sorrow, it beat in time with him now, and that was enough. When he returned to the cabin, the rhythm came with him, not loud, not constant, but faithful, and as he drifted into a sleep lighter than usual, the beat stayed beside him, like a story waiting to be told when the world finally grows quiet enough to listen. By the seventh day, the hunter no longer expected change. The rhythm in his chest had become part of him. The mask still faced the lake. The fire no longer burned across the water, but its memory still glowed faintly in the back of his thoughts. And he had returned to his rituals, stacking wood, boiling water, checking the traps he never baited anymore, not out of need, but because silence begs for motion, and motion soothes the quiet. The snow had fallen again that morning, soft and even, like a blanket folded by something patient, and as the sun hovered low and gold in the sky, he stepped outside for no reason at all, just a sense, just the pull of cold air on the skin, and the feeling that the world might have turned slightly while he wasn't looking. His eyes moved first to the shoreline, as they always did, then slowly, inevitably, across the lake, where the trees stood shoulder to shoulder like tall listeners. And there, between two trunks just barely apart, he saw them. Not many, not a crowd this time, but one figure, still and upright, like a branch that had decided to breathe. The hunter froze, not out of fear, not even surprise, but because he understood what stillness meant now. He didn't squint, didn't adjust his stance, didn't lift his hand to block the sun. He just looked, and the figure looked back, across ice and air and memory. It wasn't long, a second maybe, no longer than the flap of a raven's wing, but it was enough because in that brief connection, no words were passed, no threat implied, no gesture made, just eyes meeting across a lake that had never been crossed. And then slowly, the figure bowed their head, not dramatically, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, like one flame nodding to another, or like someone who had waited long enough to be noticed, and now was simply letting go. The hunter's breath stayed caught in his chest, not held, not shaken, just paused because the gesture wasn't for him, not entirely, but it was about him, and that made all the difference. It was a bow not to power or fear or dominance, but to history, to witness to the space that exists between people when they choose not to speak but still agree to be seen. And in that single moment, everything slowed. The wind over the ice, the distant cry of a hawk, the ache in the hunter's knees, all of it held still by the weight of an unspoken signal. He wanted to respond, but not with motion, not with sound, just presence, and so he remained as he was, feet planted, heart steady, gaze quiet, offering no command, no permission, only the honesty of standing still. The figure did not vanish but turned, step by step, disappearing into the trees without hurry, without farewell, like someone who had done what they came to do and would now let time continue. And the hunter felt something strange in his chest. Not sorrow, not relief, but understanding, the kind that sits beside you at night and does not leave, even when you sleep. Later, as he sat by his own fire, newly lit, with sparks rising like questions into the rafters, he kept seeing that brief moment over and over, not to analyze it, not to change it, but to hold it like a page marked in a book too sacred to read twice. It was the first time in many years he had felt seen without being spoken to, remembered without being named, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted inside him, not loudly, not finely, but deeply, the way ice breaks underfoot in spring. Not all at once, but in long, slow lines that run beneath the surface for miles. And from that moment forward, he no longer watched the lake to see who would come, he watched to remember that someone had waited. That morning, long before the frost had lifted from the grass, and while the lake still wore a skin of mist too thin to hold reflection, the hunter walked down to the water's edge, not to fetch something, not to track or wait or guard, but to give. And what he carried in his hands was not new, not polished, not wrapped in ribbon or string, just old wood, bent into a quiet arc, and a single arrow whose feathers had frayed at the ends, worn not from use but from time. The bow had belonged to no tribe, no war, no father he could remember, only to him, and even that was fading. He laid it down gently on the stones, not as if offering tribute, not as if begging forgiveness, but as if returning something that had always wanted to leave. The arrow he placed beside it, tip pointed toward the trees across the lake, not in challenge, but in alignment, in trust. And then he stepped back, not far, just enough to let the cold morning air move between him and the gift. Enough space for silence to settle into the gesture and carry it forward like smoke through the trees. He did not speak, did not whistle, did not watch too closely. He simply stood, stiller than the pines, waiting not for a sign, but for the quiet to do its work. Time passed without commentary. A bird flew overhead. The lake's surface stilled. The wind changed direction. And then, later, he couldn't say how much later, there were new things beside the bow. Not many, not loud in color or form, but deliberate. A single white feather, clean and long, and curved like it had just fallen from a wing. A stone, flat and black, warm despite the snow, as if held in a palm moments before being set down. And a small water gourd, tied at the neck with thin leather and placed upright, as if waiting to be accepted. No footprints marked their arrival. No shadow gave away the moment they had appeared, and yet there they were, undeniable, tangible, proof that silence could speak, that presence could reply. The hunter did not rush forward, did not snatch them up, did not whisper thanks. He only bowed his head, slow and low, and let the moment wrap around him like the smoke of an unseen fire. In that act of giving and receiving, something ancient passed between shores, not in language, not in power, but in the mutual weight of things laid down gently and left behind without demand. Later, he returned to the cabin without the bow, without the arrow, but with the feather in his coat, the stone in his pocket, and the gourd resting on his table like a heartbeat placed in clay. And from that day forward, he understood something. The mountain had tried to teach him for years that silence, when shared, becomes offering, and that not all weapons are meant to be drawn, some are meant to be returned. It happened on the 9th morning, when the air felt thinner than usual and the lake's surface no longer shimmered, but held itself still like glass, remembering how to be ice again, that the hunter saw them all, not shadows this time, not flickers or silhouettes, but figures, 100 of them, gathered in quiet formation along the curve of the shoreline, like stones placed by a hand older than weather, arranged not for show or defense, but for something deeper, something remembered. They stood in a wide arc, a circle imperfect but whole, as if time itself had stepped into their shape and refused to move. He didn't count them by habit, didn't measure their height or weight or weapon. He simply knew. There were 100 places, 100 presences, 100 quiet heartbeats carried across snow and smoke and blood and silence. And yet, even as they held their stillness, there was space, one absence, deliberate and loud in its invisibility, a breath not drawn, a place not filled, and though no one moved to correct it, everyone knew it mattered. The hunter stepped to the doorway, not armed, not clothed in anything but what the mountain gave him: thick wool, worn leather, the scent of ash, and he felt it before he saw it, the weight of the circle calling not for speech, not for apology, but for presence. No one gestured, no one summoned, but the wind did shift, and the trees did lean slightly, and that was enough. He walked slowly to the edge of the woods, stopping just before the first line of snow gave way to open ice, and stood not outside, not within, but just near enough to witness without interrupting. The warriors said nothing, not with their mouths, not with their hands, but their stillness spoke louder than fire, louder than drums, louder than grief. This was not a tribunal, not a ritual, not even a memory. It was a signal, a moment that required only to be witnessed, only to be carried forward by those who remembered, and by those who never forgot. The missing place, so precise, so intentional, was not a question, not a mystery, but a message, a silence in the shape of a name. The hunter knew it then, not because someone told him, but because the cold air pressed it into his lungs like a name he had once spoken and then buried under years of frost. The circle was not calling him in, not demanding return or penance, but acknowledging that he had once been part of it, that something had broken, and yet the shape remained, waiting not for forgiveness, but for the story to finish its breath. And in that vast frozen space between warriors, he saw more than presence. He saw restraint, respect, recognition. The kind that binds people when words no longer serve, when justice turns to memory, and when memory becomes vow. No flame burned. In the middle, no staff marked the center, but still the circle held, and still the space within it whispered not in accusation, but in invitation. And as the hunter placed his hand on the nearest pine and closed his eyes, he didn't see the faces, didn't hear the names, didn't recount the days. He only felt the shape of the missing place, like a drumbeat pressed into the snow, like the moment just before someone sits down beside you without saying a word. And when he opened his eyes again, they were still there, silent, still, waiting, but not for an answer, only for the silence to be understood. The hunter descended to the lakeshore not as one summoned, not as one forgiven, but as one who finally understood where his feet were meant to stand when silence called him forward. And though the morning was cold and the ground beneath him slick with frost, there was a warmth in the still air, not from fire, not from sun, but from presence itself, unspoken, unwelcome to noise, but strong enough to make breath feel like prayer. He crossed no threshold, made no gesture, spoke no vow, but his arrival was felt, not as disruption, but as completion, and the space left open in the circle did not move to receive him, did not shift or change, but somehow it held him anyway, like a palm long open that finally closed around what had always belonged inside it. The warriors remained where they had stood, not blinking, not acknowledging with nod or sound, but every posture softened just slightly, like trees that bend in the presence of rain, not because they must, but because something inside them remembers what it is to be part of a forest. And so the hunter stepped into the ring of quiet, not with pride, not with shame, but with a kind of reverence that has no name and needs none. His boots brushing the edge of the circle like wind touches water, gently, precisely, without insistence. He did not kneel, did not raise a hand, did not reach for the gourd still tied to his belt, but his body told the truth of why he came, shoulders low, breath even, gaze steady, as if to say, I see you, I hear you, I am not a part anymore. And though no one spoke, the circle became more than a shape, more than a line in the snow. It became a vessel, a bowl holding a history no one wanted to rewrite, but everyone wanted to remember. There were no drums, no chants, no rising smoke, but still, a ceremony unfolded, slow and sacred, made entirely of stillness and memory and the long, unbroken thread of witness. The kind of ceremony that can't be taught, only felt, only joined, only entered by leaving behind all the noise that once convinced a man he was alone. The wind that passed through them did not disturb the peace. It carried it, lifting it upward into the trees and across the frozen water, into the sky and beyond the hills, like a signal meant for no one and everyone all at once. The hunter's eyes remained dry, but inside him something melted, a tension older than guilt, a solitude older than silence, and what poured out in its place was not grief, not joy, but recognition, the kind that binds one breath to another without need for words. And when at last he closed his eyes and let the moment settle into his skin, he felt the circle move not with feet, not with motion, but with acceptance, with the slow, invisible turn of a world realigned. And from that moment forward, the silence he returned to was not the same. It no longer echoed with absence, no longer whispered with regret, but pulsed gently with the knowledge that he was no longer unseen, no longer unheard, no longer alone. And so, when he returned to his cabin later that day, leaving the ring as quietly as he had entered it, he lit a fire not because he was cold, but because the flame was now part of something larger, a signal, a reminder, a warmth left behind in the snow. And when the smoke rose into the still sky, he let it carry everything he no longer needed to say.